Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome back to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Where is the best place to study English? I get asked this all the time. Most people want to study in the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, or another native English-speaking country. But these can be expensive options. Is there anywhere more affordable to learn English? Well, today I'm joined by the wonderful Alistair Budge from the English Learning for Curious Minds podcast to discuss the tiny island of Malta and how it became a destination for English learners. We discuss Malta's history, what it's like to study there, and what kind of person should consider learning English in Malta. There will be a second part to this interview uploaded on my Patreon on Friday, and make sure to check out Alistair and English Learning for Curious Minds after listening to this episode. The full transcript will be available on the Thinking in English blog, as well as a vocabulary list. But without further ado, here is today's episode. Hi Alistair, how are you?
I'm wonderful, Tom. How are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. So, I'm sure some of my listeners have heard your voice before, but if they haven't, or even if they have, can you introduce yourself to the Thinking in English listeners?
Sure. So, nice to meet you all Thinking in English listeners. My name is Alistair Budge. I'm from the UK originally, but I have been living in the small island of Malta for the past almost 6 years. I also have a podcast. I guess that's why you said people might have heard my voice before, Tom. My podcast is called English Learning for Curious Minds.
Yeah, so I did a poll on my Instagram last week where I asked everyone's favourite podcast, and the top 2 results I got were Thinking in English, of course, and English for the Curious Mind, which I thought was a nice time to bring you on to the podcast.
Wonderful, and for anyone who voted in that poll, thank you for selecting English Learning for Curious Minds.
Yeah, so you're currently living in Malta, right?
Correct. Yes, I've been here for 6 years.
I've never visited Malta before, and I'm sure many of my listeners have never visited either. So can you tell us a little bit about Malta?
Sure. So before I moved here, I'd never visited it either. And I didn't even really know where it was. Where I thought it was completely incorrect. So maybe I'll just tell people where it was if they are, like me, unsure about where this country is. So it is a tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean. If people can think of a map of Europe, think of Italy, go down to the bottom of Italy, and there's the football, I guess, that Italy is kicking, which is Sicily, and you put a pin in the middle of Sicily, go down 100 kilometers, and you will hit a tiny island called Malta. It's absolutely tiny. It's 316, I believe, kilometers squared. So it's very, very small. And it's essentially a rock in the middle of the sea. But it has, it's got quite a large impact on the world of English, I guess, because lots of people come here to study English. And there are Maltese people all over the world doing fun, interesting things. So even though the country itself is tiny, it's got quite a big reputation.
So you mentioned the impact on English. What languages do they speak on Malta?
Good question. That's another thing that I didn't know before I came here. So there are 2 official languages of Malta. There's Maltese, which is a Semitic language, so it has similarities with Arabic, and also English. So 2 official languages. Yeah, you can get by everywhere in English. You go around, there's street signs in English, everything from the government, all sorts of official notices are in English. Schools are often in English, and there are 2 languages, Maltese and English.
How did English become an official language in Malta? And is it spoken by everyone, or is it just a language of government?
So, how did English become the official language of Malta? Yeah, another good question. It all comes back to, I guess, colonialism, unfortunately. So I can give your listeners a very brief overview to the history of Malta. It's got an absolutely amazing history, and I definitely encourage people to dive more into it if this piques their curiosity. But this tiny island was ruled by the Knights of St. John, called the Knights of Malta, from 1563, I think it was. I probably got that slightly wrong, through to 1798, so kind of 250 years or so. And then Napoleon, the Emperor Napoleon, tried to come and take control of it. The Maltese then asked the British, of all people, to come and save them from Napoleon, under the condition that they would leave after a few years. And then they never left. Malta became a British colony for about 150 years, it was. So from 1813 through to 1964, it was essentially a British colony. As British people did at the time, forced everyone to learn their language and start speaking English. And then, after Malta gained its independence in 1964, it has continued to use English as an official language. So your second question about whether it's really a language that people speak here, or whether it's just a kind of bureaucratic language, it kind of depends on where you go. Malta's a very international country now. You'll find people from all over the world, lots of people from Asia, lots of people from Latin America, of course, lots and lots of Europeans. I think in the last census, it was over 20% of the population of people living in Malta was non-Maltese. So a very, very large expat population. And so in the more expat-y type areas, which is a very large part of the country, you'll find that lots of people won't actually speak Maltese. They will only speak English. If you go into some of the more rural villages, then perhaps you'll find people whose English is not so good, but everyone has studied English at school. Everyone has to speak English really to get by in most kinds of office jobs and things like that. So it is a very good place for people who want to come and experience a kind of English immersive environment, but perhaps without the costs of London or the rain of the UK.
Right. I think I read an article recently about how in Malta, most of the newspapers are in English, right? If you want to read a newspaper, you need to be able to read English. Is that correct, or am I making this up?
No, you're 100% correct. In fact, I believe all of the major newspapers are in English. Yeah.
Right.
There's the Times of Malta, the Malta Independent, things like that. It's a funny thing because coming from the UK, Malta uses a lot of the same kind of names or kind of styles for things. So your listeners might know that in the UK there's a popular newspaper called The Times. There's also a popular newspaper called The Independent. Malta's got the Maltese equivalent, and they're both in English.
How did Malta become a destination for English learners? Because I have friends who've studied English in Malta. I've also recommended Malta as a place for people to study if they want somewhere slightly more, if they want to study English abroad, but they want somewhere slightly more affordable than, like you said, affordable than London or affordable than the USA or Canada or Australia. So how did Malta get this reputation as a good place to study English?
So I think there are a few components to it. Firstly, the fact that people can come and have a proper sort of immersive experience in English here means that it's not like going to an English school in Rome or Paris or Madrid or something, where you go to class and then you come back and you're speaking your native language. Here, people can come and get a proper immersive experience, which is clearly a good thing from a English learning perspective. Secondly, there is the cost aspect. So London, New York, San Francisco, all these kinds of big cities are expensive, right? It's expensive to rent an apartment, and tuition is expensive, whereas the cost of living in Malta is lower. So people can come and they can stay for longer, and they don't have to pay quite so much, which is clearly a good thing for everyone. Then there's also the fact that it is a Mediterranean island with 300 days of sun every year. So there's the kind of fun part that you can come here. It feels a little bit like you're on holiday, but you're also learning English at the same time. So there's definitely a few elements that have contributed to people thinking, okay, I can go to London or Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere like that, and it might be a certain price, and there'll be lots of things to do, but it's going to be expensive. Maybe it's going to be a bit cold, and actually my budget is slightly more constrained, and I like the idea of going to the beach and having an international experience. So it really depends what kind of things people are looking for. And there's the other thing also, which is that Malta is in the EU, of course, unfortunately, and I think I can say unfortunately here, unfortunately, the UK is not in the EU anymore. So what it also means is that people can come to Malta and they can very easily travel around to other places in Europe, getting on a short flight to go for a weekend in Rome or Athens or Berlin or things like that. And especially for people from non-EU countries, people from Latin America, people from East Asia, I think they find that a great thing to be able to come here and be able to just visit Europe very, very easily, and use Malta as a kind of launch pad, I guess.
How much, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but how much would you say the average tuition fees or cost of education in Malta is compared to the UK? Because I know some people who pay upwards of £200 a week sometimes for English classes in London. How much would you say it is in Malta?
It's a really good question. I don't have the kind of best prices to hand. I think it can be like kind of 30 to 40% cheaper, just in terms of the cost of going to a class. So from an affordability perspective, it is a bit easier. The other thing also to mention, and this is particularly important for people who are coming from Latin America or people who are coming from East Asia, is that it's very, very easy to find a job in Malta. So what lots of people do is they'll come to Malta and they will find a job that helps them kind of support their studies, working in a cafe or working in a restaurant or things like that, because there's a kind of a shortage of workers. So it's very, very easy to pick up a part-time job. And I've actually got a friend who has a company that helps people coming specifically only from Colombia, helps people come from Colombia and find a school and find jobs and things in Malta. So what lots of people like as well is that firstly it's a bit cheaper to kind of get started, and secondly that Malta is an easy place to find a job that will help you kind of support your studies as you go. So people will come and they might stay for kind of 6 or 12 months, or even use this as an opportunity to find a job and kind of move to Europe or do something like that.
When most people think of destinations to study English, I'm sure they think of the UK, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But I think, as we've mentioned, these are quite expensive places to study. costing hundreds of dollars or pounds a month to study. Whereas there are some affordable places around the world. Malta is one of the more affordable places. There's also the Philippines for people in Asia who often study in the Philippines, or even Ireland is also in the EU. So how would you say Malta compares to other affordable English learning destinations?
So that's another really good question. Let me give you my kind of perspective on Malta specifically, and then we can talk about how it compares. Because I don't know, I'm not a huge expert on learning English in Ireland or in the Philippines, but I think we need to go back to what people's main goal is with going anywhere to learn English. Because for most people, the English learning element is just part of it, right? If your only goal is to reach a certain level of English or get a particular certificate, then perhaps just going to going to a place and study English for a set period of time, then perhaps Malta might not be the most effective use of that, because your immersive experience might be with people for whom English is also a second language, and you might not end up learning the kind of English that you think you would learn if you were going to stay and live with a host family in Oxford or Cambridge or Brighton or somewhere in the UK. So what I do always advise people to think about is a kind of false economy. And what I mean by that, just to explain that expression for listeners who might not know what that means. What I mean is that if something seems cheaper, but in the overall it's not actually cheaper. Let me give you a working example here. Is that if you can go to Malta and you can study at a school for 10 weeks, and the same amount of money will only buy you 5 weeks in the UK. Perhaps actually you'll end up learning more English in those 5 weeks in the UK than you would in 10 weeks in Malta. But you might not have as much fun. That's the important thing. So I think for lots of people, when they're considering Malta versus Ireland versus the Philippines, let's say, you're probably also thinking about the kind of fun aspect that you might have here, because it is a place that people come to on holiday. There's beaches, there's all sorts of bars and all that kind of stuff. So for lots of people, when they're thinking about where to go, one of the components about Malta is the English learning elements. But another of the components is, I'm going to meet lots of people, I'm going to have a lot of fun, it's going to be a really international atmosphere, and I think it's going to be a fun period. I actually get lots of messages from people saying, I studied English in Malta 5 years ago or something. I didn't learn anything, but I had a huge amount of fun. And I think that's not to belittle the English schools here, because they're great. But I think for lots of people, they come here and they have a lot of fun. They meet lots of people. They make lots of friends, and they have a great experience in English. But if you're thinking purely from the kind of language learning point of view, I think what I'd also say is there's lots of distractions in Malta that could be fun distractions, but it really just depends what your goal is, and when comparing with Ireland, for example, clearly Ireland is probably going to be a bit of a more immersive experience, because English is the only I gotta go back. English is clearly not the only official language of Ireland, but you will find most people speaking English in Ireland. Versus in Malta, clearly you'll find people speaking Maltese and other languages as well. And I guess in the Philippines is probably slightly different. I actually don't know so much about studying English in the Philippines, so I should probably stop trying to give an opinion on it. But clearly for people in Europe, it's a lot further away. for Italians, let's say, I know you said there's quite a lot of Italians who come to Malta to study, and especially the south of Italy is just it's just an hour away from Malta, so it's very convenient, and you find lots and lots of especially teenagers and young people coming to Malta in the summer to study English for a week or 2 weeks, and they clearly have a lot of fun, and they get to do a bit of English at the same time.
Well, thank you so much for your introduction of Malta and your description of the studying life in Malta. If you were to, I guess, sum up in like 1 or 2 sentences, who should study in Malta? What kind of student should be looking to study in Malta?
So I think there are kind of 3 categories of people who tend to come and study in Malta. The first category, which is the largest in volume, is kind of essentially young people who have managed to, 15, 16, 17-year-olds who have probably managed to persuade their parents to send them on a holiday to Malta under the guise, under the cover of learning English. And I would have loved that as a 16-year-old. To have been sent to Mediterranean islands by my parents to go and study a language, and had a lot of fun at the same time. But I imagine most of the people listening to your podcast are not in that category. I just wanted to mention because that is a large category of people. But the 2 other categories really are people who are slightly older, so let's say 30 plus. And they normally are in slightly different classes, because people who are in their 30s and are self-motivated and probably paying for it themselves. The parents are not paying for it in most cases. You have a different level of motivation from someone who is 15 years old and has had to get up 5 minutes before their class and just wants to go to the beach. So someone who has the motivation to study and really wants to use English to kind of change their life, change their professional opportunities. They want to get promotions. They want to get a new job. They want to use English in a way that they didn't feel that in a way that they don't feel they can currently do. So that is for someone in that kind of category, I think it can be a great place. And then there's a lot of people who are sent by their companies actually to come to Malta, especially people from East Asia. So there's lots of people from Japan, lots of people from Korea, who will come to Malta for a longer period of time, and will study kind of business English and do that kind of stuff. So what I would to go back to your question, which was, I believe, who should come to Malta?
Yeah, what kind of student should study in Malta?
I think if you're the kind of person who is attracted by having a really international experience, by meeting people from lots and lots of different countries, and making lots of new friends, and it kind of thrives on that kind of environment, I think you'll really enjoy it. I think if you're the kind of person who likes kind of smaller environments as well, because Malta is a small island. So yes, if you're only here for 3 or 4 months, you're not going to run out of things to do. But it's not London, or it's not New York, or another big city where there's a new thing to do every single day. So I think independent learners who want to have an international experience and want to have a lot of fun at the same time, I think that kind of person will have a lot of fun in Malta and will benefit a lot from it.
It's a really interesting discussion, and as I said at the beginning, I've never been to Malta, and I'm sure many of my listeners have never been to Malta as well. Do you have any episodes on your podcast about Malta, or are you going to record any so that we can learn more?
Yeah, I do actually. So there's one on the Great Siege of Malta, which is this amazing period from history. Which the date I would have forgotten. It's Great Siege of Malta. It's from the It was in 1565, and this was an amazing period when the Ottoman Empire attempted to conquer the island of Malta. So I've got one on that, and I actually am just in the process of releasing a new mini-series actually on the it's a bit of a darker topic, but the assassination of a journalist called Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was murdered in Malta about 5 years ago. So Malta also has a slightly dark underbelly that we haven't touched on, but there's this mini-series that talks about the assassination of this journalist.
And if you want to know a little bit more about the dark underbelly of Malta, as Alistair has said, go over to his podcast and check out his episodes, but also subscribe to my Patreon, because we're going to do a bit of a bonus conversation afterwards, and maybe we'll talk about this topic slightly over there as well. But the final thing for you to do, Alistair, today is let everyone know where they can find you and, plug yourself.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you do ever come to Malta, or if you've got any questions about Malta, please feel free to reach out to me directly. You can reach out to me at hi@leonardoenglish.com. And if you want to listen to my podcast, it's called English Learning for Curious Minds. You can find it on all your favorite podcast apps.
Yeah, that's English Learning for Curious Minds. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alistair. So here is today's final thought. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you all did too. I want to say a massive thank you to Alistair for taking the time to come on to Thinking in English. Make sure to check out his podcast, English Learning for Curious Minds. And the second part of our interview will be available to the English Master and English Lover subscribers over on the Thinking in English Patreon. I think I'll upload it on Friday. But after listening to this episode, would you like to study English in Malta? If money wasn't a problem, where is your dream place to learn English? Let me know in the comments on Spotify, or the comments on the Thinking in English blog, or send me a message on Instagram. I love to hear from all of you. And over on Instagram, I put lots of extra content and stories about my life and about English learning. So please go and follow me over there. Thinking in English podcast is my username. I also have a Twitter account, which I don't really use that often, but you can follow me on Twitter as well. And if you really love listening to Thinking in English, please consider subscribing to the Thinking in English Patreon. As I mentioned, you can listen to the second part of my interview with Alistair. There's a whole bunch of other bonus episodes available over there as well. And I run a conversation club every week so that you can practice speaking English with other English learners, myself, and some English teachers as well. So I hope you all enjoyed this interview. I don't do many anymore. They take a bit of extra time. But Alistair's podcast is very similar to mine. And we went to the same university. And he's a bit older than me, though, I think. But we did study in the same place. And yeah, I thought he would be an interesting guest to have on today. So let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.